Hi, I'm Mary. I'm 19 now, and I have 5 children. No, I didn't give birth to any of them. My mum did. But what she also did to me is that she completely lost her mind because of love. And now I have to switch gears into grown-up life really fast. When I was 10, my mum got married to Anthony. He came bundled with his triplets, whose mother unfortunately died right after giving birth to them. So for almost 7 years, he had been raising them on his own. Ever since then, my life dramatically changed. We moved to a big house in the suburbs, and I finally got my own room, with my own personal bathroom, but I still wasn't happy after all. You see, I had to turn from the only child into an older sister, and it was an absolute nightmare. Do you remember that Peter Pan story with all those naughty boys? Well, Ricky, Billy, and Christopher were just like them. There was not a single day without them doing their naughty tricks, and naturally, I was their favourite target. They would hide all of my shoes, so that the next day, when I really needed to go out, I'd spend forever trying to find them in virtually every corner of the house. The doghouse and the attic were the most common options. Once I went to bed early, but the boys decided to not let me do that. Our bedrooms had a shared wall, and they were just quietly knocking on it for several hours, preventing me from going to sleep. I still wonder how I didn't develop a nervous tic after all of that. Of course, I told my mum about everything, all the time, and asked her to talk to Anthony about his children, but it seemed like nobody could do anything about their misbehaviour. He seemed to be on my side, because he frequently grounded them, but this only worked for a while, and then they came up with a new way to torture me. Later on, things got even worse when one day my mum announced that she was pregnant, and a few months later, another pair of twins appeared in our house. Mum began expecting a bunch of help from me. She kept saying that I was no longer a child and that I had much more responsibility for what I was doing and how I was behaving, because my younger siblings might see me as a role model. So, as soon as I turned 14, I guess I started to be a full-time babysitter whenever Mum and Anthony wanted to go out, and they did so pretty often, I have to say. So it's not surprising that I was in charge of everything that got broken on my watch, be it a kitchen window or a knee of another kid. But when I turned 17, I met a perfect guy for the first time in my life. Dave was a pizza delivery guy, and I just began noticing that whenever we ordered pizza, he was the one who brought it to us. And every time he came up to the door, he tried to flirt with me or wink at me. Once when he came another time, Anthony opened the door, but Dave didn't get confused. He asked whether he would allow him to ask me out instead. Dave was older than me and already living on his own, with a roommate, but separately from his parents. And I had gotten really sick and tired of the children's mess that was happening all around my house. Moreover, Mum and Anthony really liked Dave, so I was lucky that they didn't mind when I stayed over for a couple of days and nights with him every now and then. Of course, later I had to sorta work out these days by looking after the children while both of them went out. Dave and I had been dating for a year when we began to seriously discuss our shared future. The wedding. I know it may seem to you that I was probably a bit too young for that, but we were both so in love with each other. I was ecstatic when I was telling Mum and Anthony that Dave proposed to me. Mum burst into tears of happiness and hugged me as tight as she could, and Anthony did the same, and I thought that finally I was going to start my own grown-up life. Nobody knew back then, in a couple of months, things would change dramatically. It turned out that Anthony had found another woman on the internet a long time ago. At some point my mum became aware of that, but she preferred to turn a blind eye to it, thinking that it was just a short-term affair and nothing serious. But apparently it was something called the true love, or at least Anthony called it that when he packed all his belongings and left my mum. Jesus, it still doesn't fit into my brain when I say that. He has always been such a decent man. Who could even imagine that he'd be able to leave his wife with 5 small children? Of course, I understood how hard it was for my mum to survive such a betrayal, but in the meantime, I still had my own love life. So I continued staying at Dave's place like twice a week, but very soon I realised that whenever I came back home, I found that stuff was scattered everywhere and the children seemed to be uncared for and hungry. Mum began sleeping a lot. I mean, an abnormal amount of time, and she looked very blank. It was as if she didn't notice all the mess around the house until I told her that something had to be wrong with her. Well, long story short, at some point one of the neighbours called child services and inspectors came to check whether my brothers and sisters were sort of abandoned while living here. Thankfully, Dave and I had already managed to get rid of the whole mess in the house and cooked dinner for the smaller children right before they got there. Otherwise, they could have taken the kids away if they found their home dirty and messy, and I knew that they might come back at any time, which made me feel like I had no other option but to take full responsibility for all the kids. It was unbearably hard for me to take care of the children while my mum was going through her sufferings. I fought with her almost every day. I usually started blaming her for the fact that she couldn't behave like that while having that many children, and she ended up saying that not all of them were actually hers. Once she even mentioned that perhaps it was worth half of them going up for adoption, since their own father didn't want them. It sounded really awful. I cried at night from fatigue, and every day I was ready to throw in the towel from the fact that I couldn't manage to get my mum out of this emotional condition. While all that Anthony did was pay child support, no visits, no calls, and no weekends with Daddy. By the way, the kids really behaved themselves. They unquestionably complied with all my requests, even the triplets, and they stopped doing virtually any pranks. However, they also stopped laughing. My heart broke from pity for them and for myself, because I literally had to replace their parents. Consequently, I no longer have time for my personal life. At first, Dave was pretty understanding, but then he began saying that he wasn't ready to take care of my 5 siblings and my mother, who was clearly out of her mind. I had no other option but to break up with him. You know, when I was putting the kids to bed, they hugged me with their little hands and said that I was the best sister in the world. How could I abandon them after that? Once I had a nervous breakdown. My mum's cousin's aunt called us on a landline to ask how we were doing. She was already an old woman living in Florida, and she always sent us the best Christmas presents. And of course, since she was my mum's only relative, she knew that Anthony no longer lived with us. She just began saying how sorry she was for my mum, and I simply couldn't help but burst into tears. I told her everything. I mean, about how hard everything was for me and how depressed my mum was. The very next day, Auntie Rosie appeared at the doorstep with her suitcase. There were no words to describe how grateful I was to see her. She just came and said that she was ready to help me as long as I needed her. She convinced my mum that she needed special treatment. You know, the mental kind. So we sent her to that clinic for several months. And since I apparently had no opportunity to go to college, I had to work. I was already running a few Instagram accounts for money, and now with Auntie's help, I was able to take on a few more projects. One day I went to meet with a new client. Lucas was a nice man in his early 40s, and he had really kind eyes. From our very first meeting, I felt that he kinda liked me, but his appearance was definitely not the type that I would like back, and he was, of course, way too old for 19-year-old me. He took me to various events, obviously for work, and presented me with various gifts, supposedly so that I would write reviews about everything on his Instagram page. But I noticed that he constantly tried to take my hand or hug my shoulders and other stuff that, like, you know, it all made me feel awkward. I remember once I felt extremely lousy. My mum's doctor said that she needed to stay in the clinic for a little while more, which meant additional costs for the family. The triplets were mischievous at school and their teacher called Aunt Rosie, which upset her very much. So much so that her blood pressure got really high. In addition, I had a complete overload at work, and it was right then when Lucas began texting me something about how my day was going and so on. It seemed like this text just broke through me. I told him everything as it was, about my sick mum and about the crowd of children that I was responsible for taking care of, and about how hard it was for me. Since then, he began helping us. For example, one evening a bunch of grocery bags were delivered to our home without any note, but I immediately realised that it was from him. I felt uncomfortable about that, but I couldn't tell Aunt Rosie about him. I felt embarrassed, I guess. But I also felt that I had to give something back to him for his help, so we sorta began dating. It was not a big deal for me, especially taking into account that he wasn't married and that he was ready to take me as I was, with the life that I had. But I couldn't fall in love with him. I don't know. For me it was, and still is, just like another job. Something that I have to do.